Very good. So we continue. You know how we are going to proceed. Just to let you know, I will be strict about the time. So when you reach 8 minutes, I will do something like this. So don't get anxious. It means it's 8 minutes, so you still have 2 minutes to go. Okay? So we will start this best panel of the Congress about privacy and personal data protection in the Metaverse with Natalia MENÉNDEZ, PhD candidate and research associate at the Center for a Digital Society in the European University Institute in Florence. Natalia, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Aurelio, to you and also to the other organizers of the conference for having me here. So I feel that actually my presentation is a very good link between the previous panel before lunchtime and this panel, because actually my starting point is avatars, more specifically hyper-realistic metaverse avatars. So you can see two examples there. The one on the left is the kind of avatars that you can find in Apple Vision Pro worlds, metaverse environments, let's say. And the example that you can find on the right is actually what is called Kodak's metaverse hyper-realistic avatars. And to my knowledge, those avatars, those last ones, which are the ones that I focus most on my papers, are state-of-the-art when it comes to immersion of avatars. And actually, the starting point of my paper was by looking at these avatars, was like if the GDPR, for example, in one of its recitals, mentions facial images as potentially a piece of personal data, could these kind of avatars be personal data as well? And in this case, what I analyze in my paper is whether these avatars could be personal data and also special categories of personal data. But first, with regard to personal data, obviously I think the identifiability criteria is the key. And this is not a solved question in the data protection scholarship. Actually, there's a lot of debate at the moment. Even there are kind of contradicting by some scholars consider contradicting decisions by the European Court of Justice on what personal data is and what personal data is not, and what the identifiability criteria entails. But actually what we would have to look at to decide whether those avatars are personal data or not is precisely if they refer to an identifiable person. And this, we can also discuss it in the Q&A after, because I would be really interested in listening to your opinions. But in my opinion, if we look at the picture before, I would say that it's very, very likely to identify the people portrayed here from their hyper-realistic avatars. And then moving to special categories of personal data, we have biometric data for the purpose of unique identification. So, for example, I was wondering whether it would be possible, by applying facial recognition to those avatars, to recognize a person. Considering, for example, what Nuria said about beauty filters, I think there could be some parallelisms here, and it could be maybe possible, maybe not. To my knowledge, there's no research at the moment on this, but it could be that facial recognition systems, for example, uniquely identify people from their avatars. But special categories of personal data are also data revealing race or ethnic origin, which I think it's also a feature that it's possible to infer by looking at these hyper-realistic metaverse avatars. And lastly, health data. So I think there could be some health conditions, particularly those that can be visible, that maybe from some avatars could be perceived. And in this case, we will also be discussing special categories of personal data. If we are moving in the realm of personal data and data protection, obviously some principles apply. I will not go in details in all of them, because also I think my colleagues probably will discuss some of them. But for example, I think it's important to acknowledge purpose limitation or data minimization, in the sense that whether the data which is collected for making the avatars are not used for other purposes. Also storage limitation, in the sense that, for example, also in related to this avatar side, if I delete my avatar, for example, will the data still be available there? principles of accountability and transparency, and in relation right to access. Another question would be, what would be the legitimate grounds for the data processing? In this case, I think consent probably will be the most adequate ones, but as we know, there's also the possibility of performance of a contract or legitimate interest, which was used in the past, particularly by platforms, for data collection purposes, but this is also something that has been widely discussed, whether those bases do apply at the moment or not. And lastly, there are also considerations of data security, as it was mentioned, I think, in the avatars panel. Our biometric data, if we are discussing biometric data, if they are, let's say, taken from somebody, for example, a password or a bank account number, a credit card can be replaced, but our biometric data, our faces, it's true, we could undergo surgery, but it's an option that I would not recommend, just by the fact that your data has been taken. And of course, the question of data transfers. If we consider, Nuria also mentioned, and I agree with her, that the most important metaverse players at the moment are based in the US, the processing of this kind of data will be based on the US. It could be also, obviously, in other countries outside the European Union, also inside the European Union, but the question of international data transfers will be one that will have a lot of importance. So, the question is, because we lawyers, I think we are very good at raising problems, raising questions, but not as good as providing answers. So my intention was, okay, we have these hyper-realistic metaverse avatars, we have these data governance principles, and we have also the challenges that might arise from that. What can we do? And I proposed in my paper the use of blockchain technology for metaverse avatar data governance. Why blockchain? Why not other technology? Well, because I think because of its particular nature, I put here on my slide 3 characteristics, but there could be more. Its decentralized character, its immutable nature, and its transparency. It could be a very good technology, actually, to fit some of the principles that I mentioned before. And basically what I claim in my paper is that for different data processing operations, so the acquisition of data, the data storage, the data interoperability, and the data ownership, blockchain technology could actually be a very good addition to the mixture, particularly if we are thinking from a privacy-enhancing perspective. So from the acquisition of data, since validate transaction records and the flow of data will be followed across the metaverse, I thought that since data in a block cannot be changed without also changing the other blocks, this could be very good also in terms of tampering the data. Because another possible risk that we could have here, as I mentioned when I mentioned data security, is identity theft. So in this case, I think blockchain technology could be of use. With regards to data storage, a new block is generated for each transaction. So basically, this could mean that when certain parts, or if the avatar is deleted or is, I don't know, lost, or for example, if you want to use it for a certain metaverse world but not for another one, this could be also a good measure of keeping the data storage to the minimum. Then when regards, it was also mentioned this morning, interoperability. I think it's a very important characteristic for metaverse worlds, but also it could be risky from a data protection perspective. So according to the literature, cross-chain protocols will be the best solution in this regard, since they will eliminate intermediaries, enhancing privacy-friendly interoperability, which is also related with the last element, and something that for me is crucial from the use of blockchain for this purpose, which is that the more intermediate we eliminate from the equation, the more privacy-enhancing solutions we will have. In this case, the last one, and I will conclude of this, it's about data ownership. Again, the fact of having private and public keys will give the user the possibility to give access to whoever they want to the data. if they don't want to give it to anybody, intermediaries will be removed. And in this case, this will eliminate intermediaries, enhancing privacy-friendly interoperability. So the basic thing of here is that it will allow users to take ownership of their data and exert control over it, which is also very much in line with the EU, I would say, postulates on data sovereignty. So that the real owner of the data, in this case of the avatar and all the data which is behind it, be it personal, be it special categories of data, is the user of the avatar, the person the avatar is portraying, and no intermediates and no more people in the, let's say, chain are involved, thus reducing privacy risk. And that would be it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Now we have Javier López-GUZMAN, PhD candidate and research fellow, 2 rooms next to mine, which means at the University of Alicante. Please, Javier. Yes, here we go.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, this afternoon. I must admit I'm a bit conscious about my own profile and everything, having so many knowledgeable people in the audience, not only about the metaverse, but also particularly about personal data, and of course my fellow panelists on the floor right now. But I will try and share a bit of my personal thoughts on the research and on the matter that I was trying to build around the virtual worlds. So the title of my presentation follows the paper that I presented, which is the ubiquity of personal data throughout the virtual worlds. And some of you might have noticed, if you check the program beforehand, that a bit of a subtitle was removed or erased. Why? Because my initial thought when approaching this matter was to describe the legal framework applicable and how it is right now in terms of the international personal data transfers related to the application of privacy laws in Europe, how they relate to the virtual worlds. But then throughout the research I discovered that it's more interesting, or I found a bit more interesting to explore and to share with you, not the comment itself about the privacy legislation, about the legal background or the legal framework applicable, but more the drives or why the metaverse needs the processing of personal data, and why this processing of personal data is deeply affected by the transfers, by its movement around the world. And also it helped me meet the deadline for the submission of the paper. So it was also a practical decision. In any case, the origin of my research in this, as I mentioned already, comes from the GDPR, from the privacy legislation in general in Europe, and the strong bonds in the transatlantic relation when it comes to the development of the processing of personal data. This relation was the foundation or the base for the development of the open internet as we knew it, and the current model of platforms, of the use of the interconnected virtual life through social media and many other platforms. It suffered a very big impact by the Schrems cases. All the relation with the Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield, the agreements between the United States of America and the European Union to share personal data, and the current applicable framework that is developed. And all this relation deeply impacts, and I take here the example of the GATS agreement, the trade in services all around the world, because this is a proven fact that the free movement of data, not only personal data, but of course also personal data, enhances innovation. It's beneficial for the global economy in general. So the limitations that are established in privacy laws, and in particular in Europe, come to defend fundamental rights, but they also come or may come at a cost. While researching about these ideas, I found many different topics and subjects that I share with you here in this cloud of words, or this summary, which are hyperconnectivity, data localization, immersion, territorial scope, of course, of application of the laws, and some others. I'll try to navigate them one by one with you, but I think I will exhaust my time before I finish, and I will try to wrap up quickly. The first point of contact that most of us, or the general public has with the metaverse, is through video games. For many of you, or some of you, especially if you are parents, this is the first idea that will come to mind. Somebody, potentially a teenager or any of us who are gamers, using interconnected platforms to play, to share activity through the video games. The video games have two elements that differentiate themselves, that impact the differentiation with the virtual worlds, which are the immersion and the script. The metaverse comes to escalate these two dimensions. Of course, the metaverse, the virtual worlds in general, signify a deeper immersion in virtual reality, in virtual life, and it overcomes the element of script of the video games. These two elements are important in order to analyze how the metaverse can actually develop and escalate as a massive service in society. And there is another important element, which is the revenue model, which is, in traditional video games, of course, was based on the purchase of consoles and video games by directly paying a fee, or by directly subscribing to a service. And this was quickly overcome by the revenue model based on data. But still, virtual worlds had a limitation in its development, which was the barrier that we had before COVID-19, before the pandemic hit, on certain elements of our life being developed or encouraged only in the in-presence world, in the real world, right? There was a resistance by some companies, many companies, to develop remote work, to connect through video calls and everything, which was strongly and quickly overcome by by necessity during the pandemic. This generated the hyperconnectivity phenomenon and helped improving and helped jumping into this qualitative leap forwards to the development of the virtual worlds. Digitalization, of course, has a very strong element in the development, as I said, of the virtual worlds. And this brings us to the business model, the data-driven business model of the metaverse. The metaverse can only exist, and this is part of the research that I propose in the paper, as a profitable model and as a massive service in society in general, if it is based on the correct and the profitable processing of data, not necessarily personal data, but also, indeed, with the element of personal information. Industrial data plays a strong role, of course, but the processing of personal data is necessary, will be necessary when the service escalates in the future, in order to develop targeted marketing in a similar way that we know with traditional social media. That will be necessary to customize the service, and of course the companies interested in the development of the virtual worlds will need this personal data in order to reach societal scalability of the service, which at the moment we don't have yet. And of course this is related to the model that is already present in the platforms and in what I call the traditional social media, if we can call it like that, only with 20 days of life, 20 years, sorry, of life approximately with the traditional platforms. As I said, this is deeply based on the revenue model that will need to be developed in the metaverse and the economy of attention. The development of the metaverse has a strong challenge in order to attract users who are right now present in other digital platforms. There are relations with surveillance capitalism and the processing of personal data, but I wanted to bring into the picture the limitations that the privacy laws impose on this. Privacy laws have their jurisdiction, and one way to try and circumvent it is to transfer the data outside of this jurisdiction. That's why international and personal data transfers were created, and that's why the companies behind the development of the virtual worlds want to try and escalate the service by moving the processing to different jurisdictions. So now I question myself, or this is part of the research. What will be the relation with the principle of extraterritoriality in the virtual worlds? Where to process the personal data to reach these technical economies of scale? And what's the relation with the ubiquity of the personal data that we have in the metaverse? Obviously, we can connect anywhere in the world as long as we have an internet connection to the virtual worlds. Why are these limitations needed? And they are needed and I finish with this, the presentation, in order to develop a privacy-friendly model of this data-driven metaverse, data-driven business model. That, in my opinion, will be the only way to reach scalability and success for the platforms as we know it. And of course, the flow of personal data will play a very important role in it. That was all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Javier. Now it's turn for Shweta DEGALAHAL. Good. Coming from Tilburg University, where we have Eleni Costa, a good friend of the Metaverse chair. So Shweta, you have the floor. Here we go.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Shweta, and I'll be providing a brief summary of my paper titled Publicness in Digital Public Spaces, the Metaverse. So the research idea for this paper and as well as my entire PhD stemmed from the European Data Protection Authority reactions to web scraping incidents, where the focus was majority on, comply with the notice principle and comply with the transparency principle, which is understandable because it's their job to ensure GDPR compliance. But I wanted to see if we could take it one step back and see if publicly available personal data should be granted the same level of safeguards that are provided to general personal data. And that led me to my entire PhD thesis question on what are the privacy expectations of people in the digital public spaces. So Metaverse is an interesting testing ground, I think, for reimagining the notion of public privacy, majorly for the reason that it's in such early stages, even though we have some products and services here and there, but the fact that the entire true notion of Metaverse is still to come to fruition, it makes it a good testing ground to see if the theoretical foundations of public privacy can play a role in the design of like a safe metaverse or no. So as part of this paper, what I did was I looked at the publicness criteria that is present in the literature on physical public spaces, and then I applied that publicness criteria to digital spaces to arrive at a notion of how digital public spaces can look like. And then based on the criteria that are important in digital public spaces, the idea is to show the increased role that privacy can play even in traditionally public spaces, even though there is this traditional understanding that, there is that public and private dichotomy where anytime somebody says, hey, we are supposed to expect privacy in public places, it takes a couple of more sentences for you to convince another person that it should be possible, because it kind of sounds like an oxymoron. But what the research kind of shows that there are theoretical groundings for such kind of a claim. So the publicness criteria in physical public spaces. So most of the literature that examines what exactly makes a public space public, especially in the physical space sense, originated as a result of the fear of privatization. Because as one of the criteria says, ownership, it traditionally, public spaces were those spaces that were just owned by public authorities. So the minute privatization of these public places started, there was this fear that it was going to be the death of public spaces and you cannot have these freely accessible spaces anymore. So that's where the literature started, that try to examine, okay, apart from ownership, what exactly are the criteria that form this basis of publicness. So there are multiple models that measure publicness, and in my paper I have 2 models, but in summary, these are the 5 characteristics that make up publicness. First is the ownership, like I said, whether it's owned by a public authority or a private authority, or it is owned in conjunction, like a public-private partnership. The second criteria that is measured is control. So are there any explicit regulations that govern behavior in this space? So if there aren't any explicit regulations, the literature says that you move towards the private end of the scale of that space. So imagine it as being a spectrum, and if there are no explicit regulations, it automatically moves to the private side of the scale. But if there are explicit restrictions, it moves to the private side of the scale. And civility is, as the name suggests, are there any regulations that, that regulations or rules for that space that kind of tell you how to behave and be civil to other human beings? So physical configuration and animation, these 2 are design-oriented criteria. Basically, they examine the design of the public spaces. The physical configuration looks at the design of the space from the angle of accessibility. How easily accessible is the space? Is it disability friendly? Is that park disability friendly? Are there sufficient street lights to ensure that it is safe during the nighttime? So those are the kind of criteria, those are the kind of characteristics that are measured in the physical configuration criteria. And animation looks at the impact of the design on the use of the space. Does the impact of the design promote the use of that particular public space? For what do you use public spaces? It's for interaction with your community, it's for exercising your civil and political rights. Does the design of the space allow you to do that? If it does, then it moves to the public side of the scale. Now for digital public spaces. So I didn't find any consistent definition for my purpose for my PhD thesis on, no consistent definition on digital public spaces. The reference, I did find these references in literature, but mostly they were related to digitalized cultural archives, which I think is like a BBC initiative where they want to digitize everything, to preserve knowledge. And then of course the other reference is the digital version of the Greek agoras, basically the digital public sphere, where digital platforms are used for political communication, solely for exercising your civil and political rights. So I feel this digital public sphere forms a very small part of the digital public space. So throughout my paper and throughout my PhD thesis, I intend to use digital public space because I think public sphere is just one use of that particular space. And for this paper and for the presentation as well, social media platforms have been chosen as an example because I feel that the results of the analysis of social media platforms can easily be scaled up to the metaverse, and it's kind of difficult to analyze something in detail when you don't have that particular concept already existing. So social media platforms have been used. So when we look at the same criteria that I showed you before, when we apply that criteria to digital public spaces, ownership doesn't give us much nuanced understanding of what a digital public space can be, because majority of social media platforms are owned by private corporations. And if we go by the traditional definition of what public space is, then none of these social media platforms would classify as one, which is not my intention on the paper. So, and the second is accessibility. So when it comes to physical spaces, I think it's easier to measure accessibility, whether disability access, whether, whether it has entrance timings and stuff like that. But when it comes to digital spaces, you have to wonder if it is a significant restriction. So for example, with social media platforms, one of the most significant restriction I feel to accessibility is requiring that sign up as a user. And technically speaking, it's not a significant enough restriction because all you need is an email address and like a name and date of birth, etc., that can give you easy access to social media platforms. So I don't think it is largely restrictive and is still freely accessible. So this particular thing when it comes to this particular criteria when it comes to digital public spaces will need more nuanced understanding of what a significant restriction can be. For me, the most important characteristic that determines whether a space is digital space is truly public or no is visibility. Essentially, are actions within the space visible to others in the space as well as outside the space? And I think it is outside the space that is a lot more important. So none of the literature on publicness criteria in physical public spaces look at weightage of the criteria. Whereas I am proposing that visibility should carry a higher weightage when we are talking about digital public spaces, only because there is that lack of friction for observation in digital public spaces that don't happen in physical public spaces. Because that, it's very boundary-oriented observation, whereas in digital public spaces, there is the fact that there could be potential tracking across different websites, profiling across different websites makes it a little difficult. Public values, does the design of the space enable individuals to exercise their rights? Sorry, I have to rush through. Use of the space, pretty self-explanatory there. Privacy's role in digital public spaces. So I propose that we expand the understanding of what privacy is from that traditional definitions that rely on control and access of personal information and look at what the functional role of privacy is in digital public spaces. So what exactly is privacy supposed to achieve? So I found two main theories that I feel are useful for the point that I'm trying to make, and one is the consequence-oriented privacy by Maria Brinker and the privacy as contextual integrity by Helen Nussbaum. So the first, again, pretty self-explanatory, she basically says that the importance of privacy is there in an individual's life because they want to control the social consequences of their actions. So I think that is an important thing, especially when I was talking about visibility of tracking across different platforms. I think that is where the ability to predict consequences becomes really important. So next steps for public spaces in the metaverse. Sorry, I had to rush through very, very quickly. So I think the main point that my presentation was trying to make is that privacy is not as simple as just protecting data sets from privacy leakages, but the fact that it has to be negotiated with the individual on a case-by-case basis. And I know from a compliance perspective, this seems like a nightmare, but I think because the regulatory sandboxes, for example, that the initial panels talked about, I think that give us a very interesting space to test this theory out where we are negotiating what privacy means to individuals and how they view public spaces in the metaverse to create spaces that are safe, inclusive, and privacy friendly. Thank you.
Okay, so now I forgot Pablo. So now it's time for Pablo TRIGO coming from Vrije University, Brussels. Pablo has already collaborated with the Metaverse chair, along with Vangelis Papanikolaou. Papa Constantino, sorry, I know another Papa Nikolaos, French, Greeks. But no, it's time for Pablo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Aurelio. Thank you for accepting this paper proposal. And well, this is some kind of spin-off of the research that with Professor Vangelis Papakonstantino were doing last year on the link between the GDPR and the Metaverse, and we were trying to delve into how the Metaverse in some way is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of GDPR principles. And when, well, we presented this paper last year in October in one of the webinars of the Metaverse, and when discussing about this paper, we realized that we should put a lot of attention in this principle of data protection by design as a possible solution. But the bonus that when I start working on this paper, I realized that probably I cannot propose this approach as a solution, but because I'm just posing more questions regarding how to trying to incorporate this kind of approach when dealing with the Metaverse. Well, the presentation, the structure of the paper. First, well, there is a first introductory chapter dealing with, the concept of metaverse. Usually, metaverse paper starts explaining the concept of metaverse and the main features. I'm going to just skip that for this presentation, but I'm going to try to explain quickly this notion, this principle of data protection by default and by design too are linked, but I'm going to focus on data protection by default. Then I'm going to try to explain a little bit the metaverse data architecture in terms of the dynamics involved, the link between different stakeholders that are processing and collecting data and sharing data. Then I'm going to just present quickly some the dataverse activities that are taking place in metaverse context. And then I want to try to pose some questions regarding with this major issue of how metaverse can comply with this data protection by design approach. Well, I mean, this data protection by design is one of the core or main innovations of GDPR. In some way, this principle was in some way recognized in the Data Protection Directive recitals, but it was explicitly recognized in the GDPR, Article 25. And it was a principle that was developed by Anne Kaburkian. She was Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario in Canada. And she coined this concept of privacy by design, that trying to express this idea of embedding data protection of privacy measures from the very early stage of data processing systems design. And trying to embed these considerations when in the architecture and in the core features of any information system processing data. And we see that in some way this principle, when was incorporated in GDPR, is some ways trying to reflect this legal by design approach. It's a concept coined by Professor Mireille Hildebrandt. And she was trying to express this idea that it's necessary to articulate legal protection into ICT systems and structures that process data. Well, as you know very well, Metaverse is very complex in terms of data processing activities. There is a lot of it's a microcosmos of different stakeholders, structures, devices, software, infrastructure that are intertwined, processing data, sharing data, collecting data. I mean, one of the most challenging things of the metaverse is that the metaverse is not just collecting data; it's generating more data, and the amount of data that the metaverse is collecting in real time are, I mean, huge. It's not possible to just quantify, the amount of data that potentially the metaverse can collect, and the possibilities of just any kind of data that could be produced in metaverse settings. Just trying to collect them are quite easy. It's not very complicated trying to, track any kind of movement, behavior that metaverse users are having in this kind of environments. That is a major challenge when dealing with the metaverse, because the technology allows this kind of tracking, operations. And the chances, that's the most complicated things when dealing with the metaverse from the GDPR perspective is that the chances is that the metaverse structures that constitute the metaverse are monitoring all the behavior of users, and the chances, for example, of profiling people are pretty high, and because metaverse is collecting location data, emotional data, biometric data, even physiological data, because all the devices, all the augmented reality and virtual reality devices are collecting all the movements, all the behavior that users are having in this kind of environment. That is the major challenge of this kind of environments. And that is one of the most characteristic features of most important features of metaverse. The chances of trying to replicate, real life interactions, and for replicating this kind of interactions, you need to collect as much possible data, as much data as possible. And we have this fierce clash between the metaverse and data processing rules. Well, one of the major what are the GDPR principles, provisions, rules, rights obligations that are put in tension when dealing with database activities that are taking place in the metaverse? Well, we mentioned this before, intensive data collection and detailed profiling, identity authentication and anonymity. The chances of having real, the possibilities of anonymity in metaverse are not so high because the chances of have some kind of this kind of breadcrumbs when you are behaving, you are interacting in the metaverse, and the chances of collecting these breadcrumbs and trying to re-identify people that are interacting in these environments are not so low, are pretty high. It depends on the technology you're using, but right now the technology available in order to de-identify data are the possibilities of this technology are pretty high in terms of identify people. Data transparency and control, another important issue. And here we usually need to consider this decentralized and centralized model. Usually in decentralized model, federated models, the chances of control of one actor, stakeholder having control over all the data that is processing these kind of settings are quite low, but still this is a challenge because it's very difficult trying to identify all the different stakeholders that are accountable from the GDPR perspective in these environments, because even end users could be eventually controllers, because when they collect data from the people with which they are interacting, well, eventually they can be controllers too. That's very difficult. Responsibility and accountability, joint controllership. I'm going to focus on joint controllership because, again, you have a lot of stakeholders, data processors, data controllers, but you have different actors, stakeholders that are having some kind of decision power related to the data processing activities that are taking place in these environments. In that sense, they could be considered as joint controllers, and this is very challenging from the GDPR perspective. Data security risk, of course, because you are collecting data. If you have more data, the chances of security issues, leaking data are higher. And finally, exercising data subjects' rights in these environments is very challenging because you cannot identify all the different stakeholders, controllers that are participating in this environment. Data subjects eventually could experience some difficulties trying to approach a data controller in order to exercise their rights to access, right to portability, and so on. Well, I want to finish this with a provocation. I mean, it's very difficult in this metaverse context to trying to comply with different GDPR principles, especially with the principle of proposed limitation and data minimization, because all of the considerations that I just mentioned. And I think that when you have these different actors, stakeholders that are participating in different layers in this kind of environment, it's very difficult to try to conceive or have to embed this data privacy, data protection by design at the early stage of designing the systems. It's very difficult. And we need to consider that most of these systems are developed not in Europe and developed in the US, in which the privacy laws, privacy considerations are different. The perspective how they consider, privacy rights is not like in Europe. For example, public available information in Europe is protected under GDPR and the data protection law. In the US, that is not the case, and that's a major challenge. And I think that probably when dealing with this research, I realized that usually we hear that decentralized metaverse systems models are better in terms of protecting privacy, but probably from this data protection by design perspective, centralized metaverse could be better in terms because you just have one stakeholder that is in charge of or is controlling our environment, and the chances of this stakeholder taking all these decisions in order to embed these privacy considerations measures from the very beginning stage of the development of these systems are higher. And probably this is something that we need to consider when discuss, how to comply with GDPR in this environment. Probably this is one of the advantages that centralized metaverse models can offer when compared with decentralized metaverse. Well, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Pablo. We go now with the last presentation by Stanley Simoes from Queen's University, Belfast. Please, you have that. And here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Aurelio. Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Stanley. I'm a postdoctoral research assistant at Queen's University, Belfast. Yeah, I think compared to the other people on the panel, the other folks on the panel, okay, first of all, I have a different background. I'm from the computer sciences, and I'm relatively new to the metaverse space in the sense that I've started working on it. I think it's just been 3 months since March. So yeah, of course I know what the metaverse is, but the specifics of it is relatively new to me. This project, the project in which I'm employed right now, it's funded by the UK government's Department of Culture, Media and Sports. So it's very much about how the metaverse is going to evolve over time and what are the policies that we'll need to put into place in order to make sure that it is safe. One part of this project is the types of personal data that are collected in the metaverse, the AIs that are developed based on that, and what are the risks and threats. So that's basically more or less, it's a working paper, it's a continuous process that we are looking at. Okay, so I think the other panelists have spoken a lot about personal data. So very briefly, it's more about data it's data related to identifiable individuals. So you can classify personal data there could be various ways of classifying it. So one of the ways would be the mode, in the sense, is it audio, images, tabular data, text. So then another way of classifying it would be, is this data sensitive or not? So what we do is we just, for our purposes, we just classify it as physiological and behavioral. And we get this classification from how biometric data is classified. So biometric data is also a type of personal data, and we just extend this categorization to personal data as well. So physiological data is essentially data that is usually static. So personal data that's static. So you can think of it as maybe the fingerprints or the gender or maybe the facial, what your face looks like, or the iris. Or any data related to your eye. Then your behavioral data is essentially the data is generated due to some sort of action that the individual is undertaking. So it could be speech, it could be hand gestures, it can be handwriting, it can be the walking, the manner of walking, or the location history. There are various types of personal data that are collected, and this is just a very brief, very short, depiction of what some of them could be. A lot of AI technologies can be based on this personal data, and AI technologies are very essential for the metaverse, for its performance. And you'll have different types of AI technologies, so some of which are based on personal data and some of which are not. Again, you can classify AI technologies. It's up to, there are various ways of classifying it. So for here, we just classify it based on user-centric AI technologies and service or platform-centric. Of course, one could argue that these lines are not, this is not black and white. There is some gray area in which one may move into the other. So probably one of the most, one AI technology that falls in user-centric is user authentication, which is a very important part of getting access to the metaverse. Then you have things like face reconstruction in cases where the face is covered by your HMDs, covered by your this headsets. The other person may not be able to see your face, so your AI will reconstruct your face so the other person can actually see your face. You have things like emotion recognition and recommender systems. From the service-centric point of view, you have things such as scene recognition, in which your AI is used to identify what's actually happening in the vicinity of the wearer. And for this, many different things can be done. So for example, the platform can look at visuals of multiple users within the metaverse and try to construct an environment about what is happening. And this can be used for further downstream tasks, such as detecting suspicious behavior, which one could argue would enhance the security within the metaverse. Going even further, these behaviors can also be used for this data or these technologies can also be used for nudging people to behave in a particular way. So you could say it's kind of like manipulation, but yeah, it can be good, it can be for bad as well. It depends on it's up to interpretation. Challenges that come with the use of AI. So again, this can be categorized in depending on in various ways. So we try to categorize it into challenges that you face before the actual development of the AI. So you're not talking about any of the AI here, you're just talking about what you want to do with the data. Then you talk about the actual development of the AI, and finally it's after the challenges that arise after the AI is actually deployed. So before AI development, some of the questions I need to ask is, should AI even be done in this for this particular task? Does it even make sense to have AI here? Then there are other questions such as what type of data is required? Is this data suitable? How can we collect this data? Another question is, how do we evaluate? So once we develop an AI model, independent of or irrespective of what AI model you're using, you need some way of quantifying the goodness of this. So you need metrics for that. And as a computer scientist, we always like numbers. So you have one number, you can compare different technologies. Then what are the technologies or baselines that you're going to compare your AI with? Then during AI development, you have the choice of, okay, what type of model should you use for actually processing this data for achieving your goals. Then what is your model optimized for? What are the inputs? How reliable are the evaluation metrics that you chose in the previous phase? For how well does it actually tells you how well does it measure the goodness of your AI model? Then you have other things, the ethical aspects such as privacy considerations and bias and unfairness. And okay, so this is it. So all of this, the first two phases are mostly on your training data. But now when you deploy your model, when you deploy your AI, it's working on real world data. Some of this data has not been seen before in your training phase or in your data collection phase. So what needs to be done is a continuous assessment of your AI models. And why is this required? This is required because the metrics that you used previously or that you decided to use may no longer be suitable. And this in fact actually happens when your AI model is optimized for that metric which you're trying to evaluate it for. So there's this thing called Goodhart's law, in which is actually very common nowadays, which says that a metric ceases to be a good metric when it also becomes a target for optimization. And there are other things that you need to look at, such as accountability. Then what happens if your model actually suffers from an attack? And who's responsible for that? Of course, surveillance and control creep. Control creep is another thing, in the sense that your AI model was developed for something, but it could later be used for something else. So some of the questions, I'll just talk about two of them, two of these things. So some of the questions that we need to think about while developing these models is, so first is bias and fairness. So what does it mean for an AI to be fair? How do you measure it? Then what needs to be incorporated within AI models to make them less unfair, to remove the biases? And going further, is it even enough to just be fair? Because if you don't consider fairness, your AI models may reinforce existing stereotypes and biases. Now, if you just consider fairness, the biases and unfairness that is there in society may still remain at the same level. But do you need something like affirmative action to reduce the biases and stereotypes that already exist in society? And the next question, the next big question is on accountability. So there are two things here. So there's a safety perspective and the security perspective of AI models. So in case of safety, you're talking about, okay, if the AI makes a bad decision, who's to be held responsible for that? Because it can actually affect, very seriously affect a person's life. And from the security perspective, it's okay if your AI model is breached. So who's going to be held? Who's responsible for this? So how are you going to compensate for the person who's being affected by this? So so there are many questions that you need to ask in who's responsible in each of the stages. And is it important for a human to be in the loop in order to for grievance and redressal? So it's very much, I would say it's a work in progress, and each of these parts, each of these small things, these topics I'm talking about, they have a lot of scope to expand on. But I mean, like, what we can draw from here is that personal data collection is inevitable because the AI technologies are based on that. And it is crucial to ensure that AI is safe, and the security aspect is also important, and we are planning on looking at the security aspect going further. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Excellent. So being this one the best panel of the Congress, we have the best discussants. We have first, ladies first, so Migle Lauquite. Would you like to go first? Or? Yes. Migle Lauquite is coming from Universiteit Pompeu Fabra. She is Associate Professor in Artificial Intelligence and Law. I would appreciate, Migle and Nicolas, if you have questions, just limit it to 2 questions for the sake of time. Is that okay? Because you know we have some Italians in the audience and they urgently need a ristretto.
Okay. Well, some coffee we also need, even though we're not Italians. But okay, I will try. How much time do I have?
Do not worry. Yes. I will do the same. That Beep, beep,
I just when you were doing it, I would just realized that it's almost imperceptible. It's really easy to ignore it.
I will do it stronger.
Yeah, okay. When I see you doing something strange there, so yes, I will stop. Okay, so thank you very much, Aurelio, for inviting me. Okay. I think the things are falling, so I'm not moving you. Thank you. So I took this position, which I didn't want to take, but I think it's better, and then everyone can hear what I wanted to say. So before that, I wanted to explain that we divided papers in among the discussants, and my papers were those of Stanley and Shweta. And actually, I have lots of comments here, and you can see some drawings. But I would like to take this chance also to comment on every paper, because all of them were very interesting. And listening to you gave me a lot of ideas, which I do not want to stay only in my notes. So I simply want to comment. And later on, after second discussant comments as well, maybe if I have time, I will come back to talk to them. Okay, so in terms of, first, Natalia's presentation was really, all of them were very interesting. I was wondering, when you were talking about the hyper-realistic avatars, I was thinking about different metaverses with differently realistic, hyper-realistic avatars. And I was also, I was thinking about relating it to what Nuria Oliver was talking about, differently beautified, but still the same hyper-realistic avatars. And in terms of your solution about the blockchain, that the blockchain might be a solution to the data governance, I was thinking about this problematic aspect to this sort of governance, because, well, you lose part of your data subject rights in the blockchain, right? Because you don't have the right to cancel, you don't have the right to rectify. You use all that part related to, so yes, you get more in terms of security, you get more in terms of, well, in terms of certain rights, but you lose others, right? So you pay as well. We know that in life you pay for everything, but here you also have to pay. About Javier's presentation, I wanted to, what it made me think about was, actually you were talking about the international personal data transfers, assuming that this is something we do want to have, right? We are not talking about like European metaverse, we're talking about the interconnected metaverses, right? So I was thinking that you're doing many interesting assumptions which are not necessarily true, right? I mean that these are only one particular way of seeing metaverse development, right? So I was thinking that, well, it's just the way to see them, that there is nothing written in stone yet. and especially when we talk about about the metaverse, and the fact that you are talking about that how to make data ubiquitous. Should we make it ubiquitous? Maybe it's a more legal philosophy here, right? But the question is like, really, should we? What does it bring us? What does it give to us to be able to do to be able to transfer internationally data? To be sure, it gives to the companies, but I'm thinking about the citizens, and my question is, well, what does it bring me? Okay. Shweta, I've read your paper I enjoy it. I understand you're not a lawyer.
That's horrible, I am.
You are? Okay. No, so you're a different kind of lawyer, so it's even better because, well, you didn't have this legal imprint of lawyer, which we sometimes get kind of...
I didn't want to do that. That's why
exactly.
There's no law in
so you did it.
Yeah,
you did it. So that was very, very interesting. And I like this idea that you're like taking Metaverse as a testing zone to see what can we learn there about the publicness and about public spaces. I thought that, well, it's a problematic to speak about digital public spaces, right? Because we don't have it, and this is what you were saying as well, that, well, we take social networks as digital public spaces, but they are digital private spaces, just the same as Metaverse is, because it's private. We don't have public Metaverse, as far as I know, but maybe I'm wrong. So the point here is that when we talk about these digital public places, spaces, which still are private, it is still the only kind of public space we have in terms of being able to express ourselves, right? In terms of being able to participate in political debates. So at the end of the day, I thought about one of the criteria, we get new criteria from these new public-private spaces which come in digital form, be it social network or be it a metaverse. So I thought that it's kind of other way around, right? It's not about what publicness is in these spaces, but what these spaces make of publicness, right? So how it's kind of other way around the definition of publicness through the lens of metaverse makes the publicness different. I know it's a bit kind of tricky, but we can talk about it as well. And while you were talking about the ownership, you also mentioned this public-private partnerships, which I liked a lot because it also relates to some things that I was studying, and the idea that we now evolve into public-private people partnerships. So this is again something to think about in terms of metaverse. And in terms of question, I was also thinking what you think about the group privacy in metaverse. It's a bit kind of about Pablo's work. Thank you also very much. I had a lot of food for thought, so I'm still processing and all the great ideas I've been exposed to. And when you were talking about the data collection and also data generation, I was thinking that the data you generate is not necessarily correct, whereas it's also the question about whether the data you collect is correct, right? Because many of the data that you collect through the wearables, through other things that you put on yourselves to experience metaverse, collect many, for instance, bodily reactions, right? But they are not necessarily correct, right? And on the basis of this data, metaverse can generate certain output, which is many times is assumed to be correct, whereas it might not necessarily that way. And I was wondering what you thought about that. And again, as this data might not be correct, it puts us again in the good old algorithmic prison that many times we talk about, that algorithms decide what we like, who we are, what we are scared of, and how we react to different things. And this is where I was wondering what your thoughts were about the human oversight, right, in all these dynamics. And also among the problems, you didn't mention the enforcement problem, which I thought also is relevant, right? So the privacy rights enforcement. Should cut. Yes, okay. Okay, so the last but not the least, I was wondering also, Stanley, about the choice of fairness. Why fairness, why you talk about fairness, you don't talk about justice. Affirmative action is a brilliant idea, and the question of accountability is you have the room full of lawyers who I think will be more than happy to discuss this with you, because there's so much work being done on that. And really thanks again for your work, which I hope we'll be able to talk about without taking too much of the public's time and of other discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. I give the floor now to Nicolas de Boville, privacy officer in Meta.
Yeah. So
Sorry, I will read the floor to him, and then you will have the chance you will have the last word. Okay? Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So hi everyone. So my name is Nicolas de Bouville. I'm part of the privacy policy at Meta. And so I used to work for the French Data Protection Authority before that. So I love international transfers. So I'm going to take some time to talk about this a little bit. I have basically two comments. So I focused on Pablo and Javier's papers, but I think that my comments actually apply to all the panelists, and probably also like to the other panels that were, to the other speakers that were here today. So the first thing is I want to talk about the typology of data that we're talking about when we talk about the metaverse, because it feels to me that there's kind of an assumption that every data that we're talking about when we talk about the metaverse is personal data. And I'm not saying that this is not the case, but I'm saying that maybe this is something that needs to be questioned and looked at in a little bit more details. So obviously, the type of devices that people are going to use to access the metaverse, because I guess...
Use the mic.
Oh, sorry. Is it better?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So of course the type of devices that we are using to access the metaverse, or actually what exists of the metaverse today, allow for the collection of a number of like novel type of data, I would say. Or think about like eye tracking, think about like wrist movements, but you could also think about like brainwaves or, I don't know, you know, like muscle activity. But the real question is, why do you need those data to be collected, and is it with the purpose of identifying individuals? I think that a lot of those data are actually collected in order to provide the service or to make the device function properly. And so I think that this is something to keep in mind. The second thing is, even if you are talking about personal data, the question of whether that data is sensitive is another question. And so one should not assume that because the data is about human characteristic, by essence it should be biometric data or it should be considered sensitive information. Because here again, when you look at GDPR, you need to have a link with the purpose of identifying an individual or revealing certain characteristic. So one needs to ask that question first and not assume from the outset that this is going to be the case. I would like also to highlight very, very quickly like kind of a paradox, because we're talking about like massive data collection and we're talking about sensitive information, I mean spatial category of data, but at the same time in some cases this type of data are needed, and especially when you think about AI, are needed to address biases. So those are the kind of paradox I think that also are worth maybe exploring in a bit more details. So this is for the typology of data. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is the question of international transfers. So, I mean, what was unclear to me is, in the end, what is so specific about the metaverse that we are not seeing in already existing online services. It seems to me that there is no real differences. And maybe also to reply to the previous discussant, like why do we want Ubiquity and why do we want to allow like for international transfers? I assume that if you want to be able to interact with people that are not, in Europe or in a different jurisdiction, well, this will be needed. So I don't think that there's a way around it, at least not completely. And so international transfers are going to be, are a necessity. But I would like maybe just to challenge, like, very specifically one part of the paper. So there is in your paper, Javier, a paragraph where you say, the jurisdiction with the lesser data protection limitations are the most attractive, and considering the origin of most of the big tech companies present globally in the world, China and the United States of America are the go-to options. I think I really want to challenge this because I don't see it this way at all. I think that the question is actually more why those companies are not in Europe. It's not so much that those technologies are developed elsewhere because people want to go around data protection regulation. I think it's actually quite the opposite. It's because in the EU you have such a complex data regulatory framework. I'm not sure that the innovation is taking place in the EU. And the last point on this, I would say that for European citizens, in a way, I don't know if it matters so much in terms of like protection, considering that GDPR would still apply if the service is provided to EU citizens. So, yeah, this is what I wanted to share.
Okay, so I will give you 1 minute to conclude. We will start with the same order. So please, Natalia.
Thank you very much, and thank you to both of you for the comments. So to Miguel, I think these different metaverses with different levels of hyperrealism, it's true. Also, even, this is something I talk about in my paper, some people do not want to have a hyper-realistic avatar, they want to have a dinosaur or something like that. But what I claim in my paper is basically that for those who want to choose this option to portray themselves the way they look like, let's say, or the way they identify themselves, there should be this kind of protection, this kind of privacy-enhancing regime. Then, with regard to your point on blockchain, it's actually right, but actually we were discussing that precisely in my PhD is about the principle of proportionality. So here I think it would be good to make a balance in operation. So whether, for example, there's also this big debate about whether there's right to be forgotten with regard to blockchain. So whether we prefer to sacrifice, let's say, this right and have more privacy-enhancing solutions, for example, for data collection or data storage, as I said, or the other way around. In this case, obviously, the principle of proportionality, this is kind of obvious, but I think if research is conducted, there could be a good answer to that, is that all in all, the option that gives you more, in this case, the data subject, more benefits, will be the one who wins. But this actually might be for another different paper. And then to Nicola's comment, I completely agree with you on this question whether all data is personal data. Actually, I think this comes with the debate on the notion of personal data, and for example, the different cases from the Court of Justice of the European Union, whether IP addresses are personal data, written comments are personal data or not. And in this case, for example, something I wrote a paper recently about eye tracking data, and something that I thought it could be very interesting, it would be to have guidelines from data protection authorities, particularly, for example, the EDPB, clarifying more whether the specific use of this kind of data in metaverse context are personal data or not. I think that would be very important from all stakeholders involved. Thank you.
Javier?
Thank you very much. I must admit that I'm a bit surprised to see this strong advocacy for data localization throughout the panel and the comments and everything. I would expect that in a different forum, but it's an interesting one anyways. I liked a lot the remark, Nicola, on the mention that you did on the non-personal data being present and in the metaverse, of course, and the need to not to narrow the scope too much on what we do with the personal data, because obviously the industrial data, non-personal data, has strong presence in the metaverse, and most of the most successful initiatives around the virtual worlds are connected to this. I'm thinking about an initiative by the Renault Group, the car manufacturer, the production from France, that generated their own factories all around the world in the metaverse to improve the processing of making and everything. That was a very good one. And also, but I want to comment quickly, since we are on the hand picking on the extract of the paper on mentioning the best destinations of data. Of course, the US and China are not necessarily the best destinations for the data in general in the metaverse. I make this point related to the assumption of the idea of having the lesser boundaries for the processing in general as a booster of innovation, let's say, which is a strong assumption. I can agree with that, and I did not personally dwell into it, neither in the presentation nor in the paper, which is potentially a place to improve or something to improve in the development. But indeed, thinking about this business model that will need to be developed in the future, this will have a presence here centrally, in my opinion. And this is connected to one of the ideas that Miguel mentioned also, which are these assumptions on how the metaverse may be developed in the future. Of course, we have now the strong presence of the big tech companies in these two jurisdictions, and unfortunately, I don't see that the future will change much in Europe due to the innovation factor, right? That's why that is the point of the initiation or the base for the analysis. But indeed, the international personal data transfers don't bring necessarily something good for the user necessarily, but the free flow of data in general, I think is beneficial. It's beneficial for the companies behind the virtual worlds that are operating these virtual worlds, obviously economies of scale, as I mentioned before, and everything, but it has potential benefits for the users also, the connection with other people all around the world, but also the maintenance of the services as for free or with little charge, as they are right now, as we experience in social media. There is a bit of a trade-off there between our user experience and the development of the service as it is. So data localization is a strong temptation, I would say, particularly from the privacy angle from the European Union, but I am doubtful that it will be the best way in the future to develop the metaverse, personally.
Shweta?
Yes. Thank you so much for your questions. Firstly, what about group privacy? I was very interested in putting in group privacy because there are sections in my paper where I talk about digital counterpublics, the idea that those groups that are marginalized in the real world have some sort of a community in the digital public spaces, and group privacy will play a very major role there for them. But unfortunately, some things have to be out of the scope of paper or it will be too large. So it was a hard no from my supervisor saying, stop it, you cannot write about everything. So yeah, but I see like a lot of importance of group, and that should be a separate paper on its own, I would think. The interaction between digital counterpublics and social networking spaces and group privacy, that will be a really interesting paper. So thank you for that question. And regarding examine the definition of publicness through how public spaces are designed in the metaverse. So I've been thinking about it the other way so long that it took me a while to process the reverse question. And I don't know, because most of the public privacy theories from the two that I mentioned, and even what Julie Cohen talks about in this networked sphere, etc., there is such a high emphasis on visibility as one of the major factors that determines additional privacy protections, that I think if we do it the other way, we will go into that problem of designing something and then trying to figure out how publicness and privacy fit into something that has already been designed. which I think might be a little problematic. It'll be the same problem with Google Glass, right? Where they introduced the product and then they had to figure out how to make it privacy friendly. So I think if we examine publicness from how public spaces are created in the metaverse, we might run into that problem of cat being out of the box, unless probably it goes into some sort of a sandbox version where we still have some control over how it is developed. So I think in that situation, it'll be interesting to see if there is any difference between the publicness that is created in these like general social networking sites and with how it is created in the metaverse. So that could be interesting. But again, I think it should be in a controlled setting so that we don't have the problem of putting the toothpaste back in the tube. So thank you so much for your questions.
Pablo? Yeah, thank you. Short and sweet regarding first discussions, questions, comments. Well, I'm going to concentrate in this distinction between data collection and data generation. I think it's possible to say that to assert that in Metaverse it's possible to generate some data. For example, digital whereabouts, digital transactions, the avatar, some characteristic features of the avatars. Probably it's not possible to try to relate a real world kind of situation with these aspects that are taking place in the avatars. In that sense, it's possible to assert that in some way there is some kind of data generation in this kind of settings. But it could be, yes, challenging, of course, but I think that it's possible to affirm that possibility. Regarding second discussion and the comments, I'm going to focus in this typology of the data into Metaverse. Yes, I mean, the issue with that is that the concept of data, of personal data, is very expansive. Expansive because of the case law, because of the guidelines from DPAs, and even the very notion of special categories of data is broad, because the case law, the Court of Justice of the European Union, considers that, for example, sensitive data, special categories of data are context dependent. And that is very challenging, because we have no certainty when we are dealing with special categories of data because of the inferences. And it's very difficult to, and the other issue that is very important when considering this notion of personal data is the chances of real anonymization. Because the GDPR concept of anonymity is very, very strict when compared with the US, for example. And it's very difficult to have real anonymization. And for example, data that is considered as anonymized today, in 3 more years, cannot be anymore considered as anonymized. And that's very challenging when, in general, when dealing with data processing activities. Yeah.
Stanley?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for your comments. So there were 2 things that you mentioned, right? One was, why did I talk only about fairness and not justice, right? So yeah, I mean, personal opinion, I don't think that these 2 things, I think they go hand in hand. And the thing about, so the thing about fairness is it's not a technical construct, it's more of a social construct, and with that comes all of your aspects of justice. And the other thing is, when you're talking about fairness, it differs in different parts with different cultures, because every culture, every region of the world has its own history. So the discrimination that they have faced, the unfairness of whatever that they have faced, which reflects ultimately in your data sets and your AI. That is, I mean, like if your AI is built on top of data sets, it would catch all of those discrimination. So yeah, I mean, justice is also a very important part, and yeah, I'm just thinking of this book that, this Justice as Fairness by John Rawls, because he talks a lot about this. I mean, like how do you distribute goods and resources within in the society, so that to mitigate the injustice that people have faced, and how can you do this in a fair manner. So yeah, no, thanks for that. I'll elaborate on that as well. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Good, thanks a lot.